Madam President, I come to the floor today because I believe the great strength of our military is in the character and dedication of our men and women who wear the uniform. It is the courage of these Americans to volunteer to serve that is the Pentagon's greatest asset. I know it's said a lot, but take a minute to really think about that. Our service members volunteer to face danger, to put their lives on the line, to protect our country and all of its people. When we think of those dangers, we think of IEDs. We think of battles with insurgents, many of whom are so cowardly and evil that they refuse to even wear a uniform themselves, and they seek to kill innocent civilians. But there are, unfortunately, other dangers as well, dangers that cannot be accepted and none of our courageous service members should ever have to face. And that, what I'm speaking about, is sexual assault. And that continues to plague the ranks of our military services. It is absolutely unconscionable that a fellow service member, the person that you rely on to have your back and be there for you, would commit such a terrible crime. It is simply appalling that they could commit such a personal violation of their brother or sister in uniform. Even worse is the prevalence of these crimes. Just today, we are hearing the alarming statistic that the number of cases has increased by more than a third since 2010, more than a third. And for the estimated 26,000 cases of military sexual assault in 2012, less than 3,000 of them reported. Out of 26,000, only 3,000 reported. What's even more startling is that of those who bravely come forward to report the abuse, an astounding 62% of them were retaliated against in one way or another. 62%. And according to the Department of Veterans Affairs, about 1 in 5 female veterans treated by the VA has suffered from military sexual trauma. 1 in 5. That is certainly not the act of a comrade. It is not in keeping with the ethos of any service, and it can no longer be tolerated. We still have not done enough to put an end to these shameful acts. Well, Madam President, today I am taking action to change that. Today, Senator Ayotte and I joined together to introduce the Combating Military Sexual Assault Act of 2013. This is bipartisan legislation that we have worked on to make several vital improvements to protect our service members, to assist the victims, and to punish the criminals. Our bill, the Combating Military Sexual Assault Act, will create a new category of legal advocates called Special Victims Counsels, who would be responsible for advocating on behalf of the interests of the victim. These SVCs, Special Victim Counsels, would advise the victim on the range of legal issues that they might face. For example, when a young private first class is intimidated into not reporting a sexual assault by threatening her with unrelated legal charges, like underage drinking, this new advocate, the SVC, would be there to protect her and tell her the truth. This bill would also enhance the responsibilities and authority of the Department of Defense Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office, known as the SAPRO, to provide better oversight of efforts to combat military sexual assault across our armed forces. SAPRO would also be required to regularly track and report on a range of MSA statistics, including assault rates, number of cases brought to trial, and compliance within each of these individual services. Now, some of this data collection and reporting is already being done. So this requirement is not going to be burdensome, but it would give that office statutory authority to track and report to us on the extent of the problem. The Combating Military Sexual Assault Act would also require sexual assault cases to be referred to the next superior competent authority for court-martial when there's a conflict of interest in the immediate chain of command. This is very important, Madam President. This will help ensure that sexual assault allegations get a fair, impartial, and thorough investigation. And the President of Military Officers Association of America agrees. They have said preventing sexual assault is a duty of everyone in the chain of command. This legislation will increase support for sexual assault victims and strengthen policies and procedures for such cases in our nation's armed forces, end of quote. Madam President, this legislation would also prohibit sexual contact between military instructors and service members during basic training or its equivalent or within 30 days after the training. As we have seen with disturbing frequency at places like Lackland Air Force Base or the Air Force Academy, new service members are too often taken advantage of and abused. Madam President, in these settings, new service members have every aspect of their life controlled by their instructor. While this is appropriate for military training, in this type of setting, it is entirely inappropriate for senior service members to seek a sexual relationship with a junior subordinate. And it's our view that it's impossible for a service member to freely give consent in that setting. This bill will also ensure that sexual assault response coordinators are available to members of the National Guard and Reserve at all times. I was told a very disturbing story recently by a female service member from the National Guard in my home state of Washington. After being sexually assaulted during her monthly drill on a military base, she took all the necessary steps, including calling the sexual assault response coordinator. But when she called, she was told that because the assault happened during monthly drill, not on active duty, the sexual assault response coordinator could not help her. That those services were only reserved for those on active duty. Madam President, that is absolutely unacceptable. When one of our men and women in uniform is the victim of a sexual assault and they have the courage to come forward and ask for help, the answer never, ever should be, sorry, there are regulations, nothing I can do for you. Now, Madam President, this bill is one step to address the crisis we have in our armed forces, and it needs to be done now. And yesterday's news that the Air Force's Chief of Sexual Assault Prevention was arrested for a sexual assault is another reminder that we've got to change the culture around this issue. But I want to be very clear. The military has taken some steps on its own. For instance, I am looking forward to seeing Secretary Hagel's proposal on how to reform Article 60 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And as I think most of our colleagues know, under Article 60, the convening authority of a court-martial is empowered to dismiss the judgment of a court-martial and overturn their verdict. Many of us, myself included, have had serious concerns about how that authority has been used in sexual assault cases. So, Madam President, we are here today to introduce this bill, and I want to thank the senator from New Hampshire for her advocacy on this issue and for her help in putting this legislation together. And I also want to thank Representative Tim Ryan for his leadership in championing our bill, companion bill in the other chamber. You know, Madam President, when I asked Navy Secretary Ray Mabus about the sexual assault epidemic, I was glad to hear he said concern wasn't a strong enough word to describe how he felt about the problem. He said he's angry about it. I know a lot of us here share this feeling. We want it to stop. So I am really hopeful that both chambers can work quickly to do right by our nation's heroes. You know, when our best and brightest put on a uniform and join the United States Armed Forces, they do so with the understanding they'll sacrifice much in the name of defending our country and its people. But that sacrifice should not have to come in the form of unwanted sexual contact from within the ranks. So, Madam President, I'm very pleased to introduce this bill, and I want to thank Senator Ayotte again for her hard work and advocacy on this, and it's a pleasure to work with you, and I yield the floor to her at this time.